So
Okay.
let's talk about the Misfits, not the
Yes.
band or whatever that is, but the movie from 1961.
Yes.
We're
This
gonna
is
spoil it. We're gonna spoil
Swirly
any
spoil.
movie we talk about.
Yeah.
And you want me to do the synopsis.
I don't want to do the synopsis for this one.
Marilyn Monroe is a recently divorced woman. In fact, we see her get the divorce, who's kind of doesn't know what to do with herself. It seems like maybe she's kind of, her life has been ruled by men to a degree, but don't worry, it will continue to be ruled by men as she ends up going out to the countryside of Reno, um, Nevada area, with Clark Gables' character Guy, or Gay,
Okay.
and Eli Wallach's character Guido shows up a bunch, and everyone is broken by life. Everyone is sad about life, and she has to babysit them. There's a lot about kind of masculinity and destruction because Gay, I don't know why I want to call him Guy. Gay is he rounds up wild horses and sells them for dog meat, and she objects to this. Uh, the end. I mean, I think I know why you gave me this movie to synopsize. What I want to say about it ties into that a little bit. Immediately I saw that we are leaving 50s Technicolor Hollywood with this movie. In some ways it reminds me, Cassavetes had directed one film prior to this. I looked it up. It makes me think of like Cassavetes, although it's not nearly as kind of loose and independent. Um, but it makes me think of like a lot of the European. Ingmar Bergman was directing by now. Fellini was directing by now. I think Antonioni was directing by now. All Kurosawa was directing by now. All these more social drama, European naturalistic, like films are being happening in Europe, and I don't know, you assume John Huston is aware. I don't know if he'd have been aware of like Cassavetes' one film, but you assume he's aware of what's happening internationally with cinema.
You'd think, yeah.
Yeah, 400 Blows had come out a few years earlier. That's a big one. And it felt like that's what he was kind of tying into. Now, obviously, there's more social real stuff from the 50s that Marilyn Monroe wasn't really a part of, but they all had this very structured Hollywood feel to me. You think about like On the Waterfront or like those kind of movies. And I think it was some of the filmmaking in the Misfits. Like there was a lot of close-ups and kind of just the way the shots were made me think like he was going for something a little more natural looking.
Yeah.
Um, and it makes me think of Night of the Iguana, which you didn't watch. And even in the title, The Misfits. So 50s was all about conformity, right? About like, we're doing well. We did well in the war. We're going to enjoy this.
Yeah.
Let's all be the same kind of a thing. So then the 60s is like, well, a bunch of us didn't fit that. What do these people what do these misfits do? So I feel like in that way, the movie also ties into where we're going historically. So I thought it was really interesting for that reason. And it reminded me of Night of the Iguana and some of the stuff we're going to see going into 60s and 70s, and that the plot was very loose. It was really just kind of following this group of people as they went through this kind of there's no plot. It's a story about weakness and vulnerability and masculinity and finding a place and so on. And that made me think, so Night of the Iguana is from a few years later. It's based on a Tennessee Williams play. It's some Americans down in I think they're in Mexico, but Central America, who don't really fit in, who kind of end up as a group together,
Yeah.
And in that case, it's 3 women and 1 man instead of 3 men and 1 woman. But it has that same, so that was really interesting to me, that I could see how we were moving away, and John Huston, having directed for a while, it felt very innovative of him in some ways. But Cassavetes would never have Marilyn Monroe, like he
Right.
was very indie. I don't, the European system worked differently, but to
Yeah.
have this kind of attempt at like a naturalistic movie starring Marilyn Monroe, Clark Gable, and Montgomery Clift is kind of an interesting piece of film to me. And I don't know enough to know what else looked like that at the time.
I like how you're looking at this because that is all there. And I was actually what the in I made to this movie early on is they're walking around Reno and it's black and white, right? It's black
Mm-hmm.
and white. I'm not going
Mm-hmm.
crazy. I wonder
Yeah.
if this is actually the one that was the most expensive black and white movie. I think it was Some Like It Hot, but anyways. Well, okay, so two things. One, Some Like It Hot
I think
is
this is the most expensive black and white movie. I think you
well,
mixed
I
it up.
screwed up, but
It's
either way,
fine.
this was a flop, and Some Like It Hot, I think, made money, but not as much as it could have. I don't know. Who knows?
Yeah.
Maybe I'm wrong. So Some Like It Hot has some of that 50s craziness in it. So we're like,
Yeah.
it's not quite as morally confused as, things we'll talk about in just a minute,
Or Bus Stop.
or Bus Stop, which came out a little earlier. Like, it's not as morally confused and weird as that, but it is kind of kooky 50s. Like, we're sort of at the end, we're going, West Side Story is early 60s, but so there was still this stuff, but like you get a little bit of that. Whereas the Misfits is more of an attempt towards like realistic type cinema and realism and all that. It's not there yet. It's still Hollywood, but all these overdone
it still
lines.
has this very, well, let me get to that. I get to talk about that. But
I
it's
won't
still,
talk about it.
it's starring these big stars, and it still has kind of a Hollywood climax to it. Like,
Yeah.
that's not how Ingmar Bergman would end it, I feel like. You know what I
No,
mean?
not really. But so, okay. And so we're going from Some Like It Hot to the Misfits, and we're kind of shifting eras a little bit between the two.
Right.
And I was looking at it, them walking around Reno, and I'm like, this is reminding me of Carnival of Souls, just because of her running around the streets in Carnival of Souls. Kind of it's black and white, and it's Carnival of Souls is only a year later, and it didn't become popular until after it was released much later. I think it became popular as a rerun on TV.
Yeah, Carnival of Souls, yes.
Yeah,
Something
and
like
so
that.
and I'm thinking about Carnival of Souls because Carnival of Souls has a similar issue, I think, where it's kind of this thing where we're moving into an attempt at realism,
right?
Which is where movies shifted to, I guess, in the 60s, and how they have kind of been since then, or at least not all movies, but there is an attempt in a one style of filmmaking is to go for more realism, more sort of, this is how people actually are. And Carnival of Souls is caught between, stylized, weird, sort of like theater, sort of big Hollywood acting and down to earth realism, nobody casts and kind of simple plots and that kind of thing. And the Misfits, I think, is in the same place as Carnival of Souls, which are not two movies I would have ever put together in my head until having seen them. But now that I've seen them, I enjoyed the Misfits, but it does kind of get caught in that area where it wants to be like these European movies you're talking about, or Cassavetes or something. I don't really know Cassavetes that well. I'm sorry, I should watch his movies. But caught between something like that and something like, I don't know, something bigger and broader.
On the waterfront or
yeah. Sunset Boulevard. I don't know, just
yeah.
something much more. The African
Yeah.
Queen, even that's a different Huston film. It's caught somewhere in there.
Right.
So that's my thought for that. You may now discuss the dialogue if you so desire.
So my major problem with this film is that the dialogue is overwritten. From Karina Longworth's, you must remember this on Marilyn Monroe and stuff I've read. Arthur Miller was working on rewrites while he was doing it, and everybody speaks in philosophical statements all the time. Yeah. And it feels to me like an East man, and I'm going to be, I'm making huge presumptions here, but it feels like a man from the Northeast, from the East Coast, writing what he thinks cowboys would talk like, but making sure they still sound smart. And it is just endless kind of philosophical statements. I don't know how else to put it. And no one's like, well, I'm hot. It's like, you know what it's like to be hot. It's like they can't just have a simple conversation. It has to be these greater statements about life. But people don't talk like that. and people who are not all cowboys, but I think what Arthur Miller is going for, like people who are uneducated can still be very intelligent and say intelligent things, but they're not going to
Yes.
talk like they're from New York and went to Ivy League schools. They're going to just use different words and say things differently.
Right.
But he's got something weird going on. But on top of that, I mean, we were just talking about how John Huston's trying to do this naturalistic style. It feels very unnatural. So even without the overwritten parts, some of the stuff that did work sounds like people in a play. People talking like they are in a play, but they're shot like this is supposed to be real. So the style to me of the dialogue clashed with the style of the movie itself. And those things were, you get frustrated when you see bad filmmaking. I don't. I get frustrated when the dialogue, dialogue doesn't need to always be brilliant. I love plenty of things where the dialogue just is fine. Exposition is a thing that needs to happen.
Right.
Sometimes you just do what you got to do.
Sometimes Udo Kier just tells you it.
Yes, and depending on what the movie is, it's more or less important for the dialogue to be a certain way. But in this case, I felt like it's clashed stylistically, and it was kind of overwrought because you have this movie and the house that Gay and Rosalind, I think is her name, Marilyn Monroe's character, are staying in. It's only partially, it's like everything had to be a symbol for something. And when everything is at a 10, it kind of becomes meaningless. When all the, when Eli Wallach as Greedo is like driving and crying about how as a bombardier, he was a blind bombardier, just, killing people he didn't met. It just, you stop feeling anything. So
it's
that
overwrought.
all didn't work for me. And I think, that's what I have to say about that.
So I have a thought on the dialogue and this aspect, which is it is overwrought. And because it's overwrought, you just sort of lose the emotion of it.
Yeah.
It's not that there's no emotion. It's that you have emotions and then they start talking in a certain way and you're like, Jesus, this is like, it's like too much.
All the emotions are intellectualized, so it's very, you don't feel them.
It's very heady.
And that's what why I was saying philosophical. It's like every feeling is intellectualized. No one is genuinely feeling anything. They're talking about the greater meaning and experience of their feeling constantly.
Yes, and what my takeaway, because ultimately I tend not to mind so much if the dialogue is a little bad or overwritten, as you said, doesn't bother me as much. But at the same time, something you learn if you get interested in writing is that every character needs to have their own voice, or at least that's one of the theories and one of the ways people are suggested to write. And each actor is their own actor in this movie. It's not like Montgomery Clift and, Eli Wallach are the same person, but their dialogue sounds similar in the way that they're sort of giving these platitudes or like these eloquent phrases or like, well, I should do this, maybe out of all of them, Montgomery Clift might have the least sort of to say in terms of eloquent phrases. So he sounds a little different, but like
he felt the most differentiated. And I agree.
But Eli Wallach, Clark Gable, and Marilyn Monroe, they all sound the same. They don't really have unique individual voices, as far as I can tell. Like there's this one line that Clark Gable gives, you look so sad, or I've never met someone who seems so sad as you. And that apparently comes from real life. And it's a great line. But later when you have like Wallach going, well, I was a blind bombardier. I was throwing bombs on people I didn't even know. And it's just, those lines sound like they come from the same person. And so it's one thing if you have one character who's, a cowboy, speaks like a cowboy, but is intelligent and smart and speaks in a certain way, that's fine. But when kind of all three of them, plus Thelma Ritter's character, are delivering lines in this, these lines and they're written this way, it's It's too
There's some
much.
really good lines in there, but they just get lost in all the other ones that are trying too hard.
Well, and we were talking about Treasure of the Sierra Madre because we were talking about Huston and his filmography, and we've seen in several of his movies. And Treasure of the Sierra Madre has, badges. We don't need no stinking badges. It's a great
Yeah,
line that's been copied everywhere.
yeah,
And that movie to me is more memorable for how differentiated the characters were. You have Walter
right.
Huston, John Huston's dad, playing a specific kind of character. And I just always remember that character. He doesn't really seem like a real person, but then again, he seemed like not a real person, except, I know somebody like that. He's that
Well,
kind of,
it's more visceral. That movie's more visceral. It actually
yeah,
has more. It doesn't have this intellectual quality that's overdone in the Misfits.
yeah.
And the thing I forgot to mention that you're reminding me is too is that the dialogue is like wall to wall in a lot of the scenes. People are just talking through the
There's a
entire
few,
scene.
there's few,
Whereas I don't remember Treasure of the Sierra Madre being like that. I remember there being silences and moments where the actors can act without it having to be a conversation. And I don't know I don't know Arthur Miller's work very well. I understand he is a very good playwright. But maybe there was some quality of having him do this film, and he and Marilyn Monroe's relationship was falling apart, that it just felt like he needed to, again, making huge suppositions about who he was and what he was trying to do,
yeah.
but like it just filled this movie with just noise.
There's some action scenes where there's no dialogue, but otherwise it is pretty much wall to wall dialogue. And we thought it looked really pretty. And the cinematographer was Russell Mitty. Got that right?
Medi,
Meddy?
Metti, I think, something like
Yeah,
that.
Meddy. And had done cinematography on
Metty, sorry, Medi.
Meddy. So he did cinematography on a number of movies, and it's very well done, very pretty, and I like the way it looks. But it's also, you can move the camera more now. It's still not the 70s or whatever where we get to really, cameras that can do a lot of things, but you can move the camera a little more now. And the action scenes and the way the action scenes are shot really work. The horse scene, the wrangling of the horses, the
Right.
plane, all of that looks great. I really like those scenes. It doesn't work as well when you're like they're trying to find interesting angles to film these people talk to each other. And these angles are interesting. They're in the house, and we get
Some
Eli
of them are
Wallach.
interesting and some of them aren't. You're right.
Yeah, and like you get Eli Wallach opening that thing and looking at Marilyn in the closet, and that's kind of a neat scene as she's trying to show up. But then you get them sitting in the living room, and Eli Wallach is in that chair, and it's like it's not bad. It's just it's kind of too crisp. Again, it's
Yeah.
this weird thing where it's like if it was grittier, maybe we slant the camera, maybe we do some moving shots. It's a
Yeah.
bit too stationary, and I'm not sure if that's because again it was the cameras they were working with, and John Huston had been a director for a while, been directing movies, so maybe that was his style, but it just doesn't quite mesh together. And I should say, I mean, I think you've said this, but I enjoyed this movie. I think you enjoyed this movie, but it
Yes.
doesn't, yeah, it just doesn't
It's an
quite get
odd
there.
it's an odd duck.
Yeah.
Let's do you want to talk about Marilyn's performance a little bit?
Well, I have my last thing about Houston, and then we should talk about Maryland. But so Houston, one of the things I like about this movie is I mentioned for Some Like It Hot that Billy Wilder probably had some idea of how like society worked, and like he had an interest in like women's place in it and like stuff that wasn't necessarily, you
Mhm.
know, the majority viewpoint, you know.
Mhm.
And John Houston didn't have any of that shit as far as I can tell. He was interested in men and masculinity, and
Yeah.
that's what he cared about.
He
And it's
seems
not
to have been
like
a man's man.
yeah, and from what I've listened to from You Must Remember This, Man's Man, and this movie is about men. Marilyn
Mhm.
Monroe's in it, and I think she has some interesting lines, and her character has something to it. I know that she didn't necessarily like the character, and there is some. I mean, it's still pretty much the virginal,
We'll get
trope.
to it. We'll get to the Maryland stuff.
But Houston is interesting to me because he is a bit of a time capsule. Like, and you see him later in Chinatown as an actor, and he's playing this horrible character. And I'm just looking at him and I'm like, I know that you weren't this person, John Huston, but you scare me a little. Like John Huston scares me a little in that role. And
Right.
like he's just such a man's man. So I kind of appreciate like watching something he made as sort of like a peek back at that kind of thought process and like that. And there are men now who I'm sure believe in that kind of thing and who have that kind of thought. Whereas I'm like, well, it's not like all of his characters are toxic. You know,
Yeah,
their masculinity is fine. It's a neutral concept.
right.
But I wonder if he doesn't realize that sometimes his characters are a bit toxic and not good. So
Well,
like it's fascinating from that aspect.
he reminds me of Akira Kurosawa. You know, I make a lot of guesses as to directors' attitudes about certain things based on their films.
Yeah.
And, you know, you can watch films where it's like, I think this person hates women. He and Akira Kurosawa, John Huston, both don't seem that interested. Whereas, like, Ingmar Bergman, I think, kind of like thought women were victims of the world, but he also thought men were victims of the world. And like Fellini, I think, loved women and was fascinated by women, but also thought they were aliens from another planet. But he was
Right.
like interested in them.
Yeah.
John Huston's not, and Akira Kurosawa just don't seem that interested. Like, they don't
No.
hate women. They don't dislike them. If they meet a woman, they'll be nice to them. But I mean, and again, making huge suppositions, but that seems to be, and they didn't necessarily write, you know, the screenplays for the movies they did or so on. So, you know, it's you know, auteur theory is flawed for that reason, but
Yeah.
it sure comes out in his movies that women are just kind of a
Yeah.
thing in the world, you know, like couches, you know, like
Yeah.
they
It's
have a
that
purpose and you don't think about it too hard.
weirdly, like, you know, you watch some of the you watch some movies where women feature more prominently in them, except that they're like, you know, exploitation flicks, and it's like that's probably more problematic on the whole, but it's also problematic, and you know, you bring this to my attention sometimes, that like it's problematic by omission,
Yeah.
like the omission of women characters in a movie where there should be women. Like
Yes.
this isn't Misfits, not isn't really that, because there is Marilyn Monroe, but she's the only. I mean, Thelma Ritter's there too, so I don't
Yeah.
know. But like, it does start to feel like she is a piece of wallpaper for the other
Well, it's not
characters.
like Bus Stop in that, you know, Marilyn Monroe's character falls in love with a man who kidnaps and assaults her.
Right.
But it's also hard to take Bus Stop seriously, and this is a serious film,
Yeah.
and that makes it different. So
Bus Stop, maybe the people wanted it to be taken seriously, but because of how it is, we just can't, which
yeah,
maybe saves it a little from that. Whereas
yeah.
this, let's start talking about Marilyn. Like, Marilyn is still a good actress, and she's doing
It's
stuff with
neat to
this
see
role.
her do a more realistic performance, or more a more. She has more screen time and more to do in some ways than the other movies we've been talking about. But
Yeah.
again, she's just kind of reacting to everything. She's just it's not that different from Some Like It Hot in some ways, except that it's a better character even.
Yeah. I
But
mean,
she's just a bundle of emotions wandering around reacting to the men.
right, and I keep going back to Gentlemen Prefer Blonde because there's an honesty to the characters there that I think Howard Hawks and whoever wrote it, who I've now forgotten, and the
Mhm.
actresses bring to it, even
Yeah.
though they're still underwritten, all things
Yeah.
considered. But there's enough there that it
But it's
isn't
the
as
nature
bad.
of a movie like Gentlemen Prefer Blondes that the characters are not going to be deep. Like
Right, and so it kind of
and that's what I
works.
was talking about with dialogue too. Like, I don't need brilliant dialogue in Gentlemen Prefer Blondes necessarily, although I think it has some good dialogue.
Yeah,
Um, it's the nature of that kind of a movie that your characters aren't going to be deep. Your characters should be deep in the
the
Misfits.
Misfits, and it's just she's deep in the sense of like if there were no other virginal, you know,
Well, she's
sanct
not virginal in the Misfits.
she's pure.
She's pure. Okay, I'll go.
She's pure. She's so this movie, and again, we talked about how it's all about masculinity. It's about fathers and mothers. Marilyn Monroe needs fathers. The other men all need mothers.
Yeah.
And that's really what it boils down to. And that's why it's like, I don't mind simplistic ideas like that, but in a movie that's kind of trying to be something more than that, it's just a little bit deflating
Hmm.
because it doesn't ever feel like it explores that well enough. And Marilyn Monroe, who is the pure mother character, delivers those lines of dialogue as best she can and reacts to things and has to yell at Clark Gable and run out into the there's
That
this.
might have been my favorite part, where she just runs out and screams at them, but she's still, Clark Gable still kind of gets the last moment. I'm going to say that the men characters to me weren't necessarily deeper, but they
Yeah,
had a little more agency.
yeah,
Like, so that at the end, one of Guy's last, or why do I call him Guy? One of Gay's last statements is like, I just wanted it, I forget exactly what he says, but the gist of it is
I wanted
he
to make my
wanted
own
to make up
choices.
make up my own mind. And it's like, well, that's lovely for you, because Marilyn Monroe's character doesn't, and there's a little bit of suggestion within um the dialogue, and I think this is part of what upset Marilyn Monroe, that her husband was writing this about her, that she doesn't have agency. Like, I think part of what the movie was saying is that she really has just been floatsome or whatever, just floated from man to man, but then give us something else,
Yeah.
like, instead of just watching that happen.
Yeah, and she makes like one choice at the beginning of the movie. Well, she gets her divorce, which is, I mean, that we like the first 20 minutes probably a bit more because
Well, because
she
she
gets a,
also decides to go out there,
that was
and
the other thing. Yeah,
she
those are the things
decides
she
to
gets to
be there
do.
with Gay, and after that, she's really just kind of going along with these men on this thing that any reasonable person would know she doesn't like. Why would you take your girlfriend on that horse wrangling?
Well,
Like, it just
and
like,
there's
why is
there's
it's just to make a point for
there's two
the
things
audience.
to me. Gay gets to make that last, he wants to make that choice, and I'm fine with the idea that you need to be responsible for yourself, right? That's
Mhm.
fine. Not, Marilyn Monroe doesn't because she's a woman, I guess, but Gay needs to be responsible for things. I mean, it's
Right.
fine, responsibility. But then Karina Longworth talks about this, I think, where like, I mean, and it's subtext, it's not, on the forefront, but Marilyn Monroe, like, she's looking for like a father figure, is what you can tell from the beginning of the movie. And she immediately goes to bed with Clark Gable, who's looking for a woman, I guess, and
Yeah.
maybe a mother by the end of it. That's my thought on it. And so she immediately goes to bed with him, and it's kind of tragic, that here she is sleeping with another man,
Yeah.
and it doesn't feel good,
Yeah.
like it's not. And
And
again,
they end up together at the end, which goes back to how this has this like European naturalistic feel, and yet the Hollywood ending of her and Gay riding off together in that truck, and it doesn't feel good. It
yeah,
doesn't
and
feel
so it's
great.
like, and again,
But
I liked this movie, and I liked the action scenes, and I think there's something here, but it's just I
yeah,
get so frustrating
for
to
me,
see that.
it's more interesting in an intellectual way, which kind of
Yeah,
goes along with, I wish the dialogue had been less intellectual.
yeah.
And no no film represents its era. No era just cleanly ends and goes into the next. And I think this is a really interesting film. The fact that it's Marilyn Monroe's last completed one, Clark Gable's last completed one, Montgomery Clift isn't going to be with us that much longer. Like,
Yeah.
it's a really interesting film, but I have trouble imagining who I'm going to recommend it to that isn't
It's kind of a Western. You can recommend it to people
like
who like
Some Like It
Westerns,
Hot.
but
If people like comedies, watch Some Like It Hot. It's, why not? But like, if you like horse movies, like, I don't think so.
no, it's a Western. If you like Westerns, you might want to watch The Misfits. Like, that's really what it looks like to me.
Yeah.
And it has an interesting bit in it because Thelma Ritter and Eli Wallach lived to be quite old.
Yeah.
And
Thelma Ritter didn't. It was the lady in the
oh,
church. It's oh, what's her name? I'm gonna find her name.
I think Eli Wallach made it to 98,
Estelle Winwood made it to 101.
which is
So
very
she's the lady who was collecting money for the church while
right.
Marilyn did the paddle ball to get money for them to do
Right.
something.
And Eli Wallach made it to 98. But
Yeah,
meanwhile, Clark Gable dies I think, 12 or something days after this.
right.
This is Marilyn Monroe's last completed movie. I think she dies two
The
years
next
later,
year.
the
The
next
next
year.
year.
And then Montgomery Clift, who he looks really good in the role as a battered, sort of beaten young cowboy type. And I'm wondering how much of that was makeup and how much of that was Montgomery Clift. I don't know.
Yeah, yeah.
He's in a few movies. I mean, he lives another, I think, 7 years, but he's only in a few movies after this because I think he was just really
5 years.
not
He
doing
lives
well.
5 years. Yeah.
Yeah, like he wasn't doing well after this. So there's an odd. It's kind of like Rebel Without a Cause, where there's this kind of odd
Mm.
aftertaste of the movie where, like, a lot of those stars kind of went on to tragic ends. And
Or Stand By Me. I was talking, a friend recently watched Stand By Me, and I'm like, if you watched it in the late 80s and 90s when Corey Haim, I think, no, it's not, Corey Feldman was starting to fall apart. River Phoenix had gotten stabbed to death. There was a tragic
yeah,
note to that movie.
yeah,
that you don't feel the same way now
No.
because
So
it's further away from that.
and it's weirdly, I guess we should probably start concluding this, but also conclude our thoughts on Marilyn now that we're done with our
Hmm.
month of Marilyn. And I was listening again to Karina Longworth's episode 2 and 3 of Marilyn. It is, she is a woman who, as far as we know, was molested when she was young. She was in foster care. She didn't have great mother figures. She didn't have much in the way of father figures. And these movies that she was in often reflect her trying to find, men with money. And really, The Misfits, as her last movie, where she's looking for a father figure and she has to be a mother figure to all these broken men. Like, it's, I was thinking, like, what if she made it to 80? And I'm like, if
Hmm.
she made it to 80, that would have been wonderful. No one deserves to die young from either suicide or a drug overdose, either
Hmm.
way. If she made it to 80, she probably wouldn't be quite as famous because she would have lived past that era and hopefully would have gotten herself together. Who knows? Sometimes when someone dies young, you get
Right.
all that stuff that you have of them is kind of this glimmer moment, and you
Right.
don't have the decline necessarily for Marilyn. And I think of the Misfits, and it's like that kind of is the movie that is the last movie she made.
Yeah.
It's just it's got it that
It adds something.
it adds something to her legacy that's the last movie she got released,
Yeah.
even though she
Yeah.
worked on another movie that didn't. And my parting thought is like, I feel a little sad about Marilyn. I liked her
I
movies, but
think
I
that's
feel a little
part of why I
sad.
like her. And her death, which was likely a simple drug overdose, probably, I kind of agree with Karina Longworth. I don't think it was a suicide. And it's interesting to me in that I think she was one of the first mega stars that died that way. And I think that's why there's so many conspiracy theories around it, because now Prince, Michael Jackson, Corey Haim, like all these other, relatively famous Philip Seymour Hoffman, Heath Ledger, unfortunately, a lot of movie stars and music, famous musicians, Elvis Presley, I think, have Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin. Like a lot of people have died, but I can't think of anyone before Marilyn Monroe who was as famous as she was who died that way. And
Alcoholics, but not really drugs.
um, it is sad and tragic, and it definitely colors her legacy. I think I found an unexpected interest in following her movies and kind of seeing how much of that era she was, and kind of watching that era slowly change a little bit.
Yeah.
And um, I wish I don't know how much people talk about Marilyn Monroe outside of film. I mean, who knows? But I I'm a little sad we didn't get to any of you and I had talked briefly about maybe watching, the biopics about her. Like,
Yeah.
I wish the narrative about her were a little different though too, because I think she was a tough woman too at the same
Yeah.
time. And
Yeah.
there was something, she wanted to be a star. She worked hard. She had her own production company.
She was a working girl.
And artists being unhappy with their performances and taking it really hard and needing emotional support is a thing,
Yeah.
like that again goes to the people I just mentioned. Like most of them felt that same pressure and that same struggle and frustration. And so, it'd be nice to have a different narrative about it.
Yeah, and I want to watch the biopics too. And I just said she was a working girl. That's probably the wrong term, but like she made money. She was a powerful person with influence.
Yeah.
And I think about, just stuff we've listened to about Barbara Streisand or other women, Polly
Hmm.
Platt. Like it's interesting, like where Marilyn Monroe probably fits in this lineage of women trying to use, influence power. And
Yeah.
one of the ways to do it in that era, this is post-war, so I think more women are working, but this is still, the women are not necessarily occupying places of power. And Marilyn Monroe was a woman who had power. She was an actress. Entertainers tended to be where women had more power, I think, for a while. And it's interesting how she fits into that. And I feel sad because she didn't get to live longer, and some of the tragic personal stuff, and also that she didn't really get to sort of be powerful going on into life. So it's,
Yeah.
but there was more there than necessarily people might give her credit for, at least the very blanket sort of sometimes what you hear about her, there's more there.
Yeah.